Apple says the iPhone 14s have the best battery life ever on an iPhone, so let's test that. Here we've got all the new iPhones, the 14 Pro Max, the 14 Pro, as well as the regular 14. Last generation's 13 Pro Max and 13 Pro, as well as the 13, the 12, and the SE. So let's jump right in with some YouTube. As always, I've matched the settings on all of them with Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and location enabled. There's no SIM card in either of them, and I've matched them to the exact same brightness. I'm very excited for this test because the 13 Pro Max last year had the best battery life I've ever had on a smartphone. In all the battery tests I've done, it always was unbeaten. So I'm very curious to see if the 14 Pro Max can beat it. Generally, I have high expectations for the iPhone 14s, but to be honest, I am skeptical that they will beat their predecessors. The iPhone 14 is just like an iPhone 13, not much has changed, it's pretty much just a rehash of the same thing. Same chassis, same design, same display, and even the same chipset. It does have a slightly bigger battery, but I mean slightly, like 1.2% bigger to be exact. The 14 Pros on the other hand have gotten bigger upgrades. Not only do they have the new A16 Bionic chip, but the displays are now using the LTPO technology, which has gotten big battery gains on other devices. But don't worry, I've cleared my whole day for this battery test as I've learned from my experience with the iPhone 13 Pro Max. 30 minutes in, there wasn't much of a difference, but after an hour, the 14 Pros are pulling ahead a little bit over the 13 Pros by 2 to 3%, not much. Both the 13 and 14 I tied up as expected, but surprisingly also tied up with the iPhone 13 Pro Max. I doubt it'll stay that way though, but we'll see how that develops. The 12 is doing alright and the SE is in last place as expected. Now you may have noticed that the iPhone 14 Plus is missing. It's really just a bigger iPhone 14, but unfortunately it's not out yet. It is a shame though because Apple claims it has incredible battery life, but don't worry, once it's out, I will make a full battery test on it. So make sure you're subscribed to not miss that. Now with all of them lined up so nicely, you can see the evolution of the notch and how much nicer and cleaner and just generally aesthetically pleasing the new pill cutout looks compared to the notches. It makes all the others look at least 3 generations older than they are, and the SE looks ancient anyways. In terms of the actual displays, not too much has changed. The 14 has the exact same screen as the 13, which wasn't a big upgrade over the 12, just got a little brighter. All of them are unfortunately still 60 Hz. The 14 Pros have gotten an upgrade, but they're still basically the same panels as on the 13 Pros. They just get a lot brighter and use that new LTPO technology, which allows them to go down to 1 Hz instead of just 10. That should help the battery life, but it looks like, unfortunately, it is limited to the always-on display. 2 hours in, the new Pros still have the upper hand. The gap is widening now, with the regular Pros having a 5% gap and 4% gap on the Pro Maxes. This is kind of hard to believe for me because the 13 Pro Max's battery life was just so good. I don't see Apple increasing the battery life on it because I don't think anybody bought a different phone or switched to a different phone because the battery life just wasn't on par with the 13 Pro Max. It just wouldn't be a very Apple thing to do to give you extra battery life when you don't really need it. And that is probably also why the battery capacity is slightly smaller on the 14 Pro Max, because the battery life was just good enough on the 13 Pro Max anyways. The 13 Pro's battery life on the other hand was very good, but wasn't breaking any records either. And that's why probably it has the biggest battery gain out of the whole lineup, just 3.4%. Of course that isn't much, but up to this point it is translating into better battery life. Meanwhile, the 14 has managed to pull ahead a single percent of the 13, but at 3 hours, they're back to being tied. In fact, they're also tied with a 14 Pro now. As predicted, the 13 Pro Max has pulled away and the 14 Pro Max is leading comfortably. And the SE has completely fallen behind with less than half remaining. It is good to see that the 14 Pros have better battery life than the 13 Pros, at least up to this point. Back when I got the iPhone 13 Pro Max a year ago, battery life was just outstanding. There were some days where I finished with 40% battery remaining. But recently I have noticed a little drop off in the battery life. It's not bad by any means, but it's just not as incredible as it used to be. It's not as dominating as it used to be. And the same unfortunately is true for the 13 Pro. So I'm hoping that the 14 Pros have more headroom to ensure better battery life, not just now, but for the years to come. Now let's test the chipsets by running a few benchmarks. I know this isn't something you do in a normal day. Believe me, not even I'm doing it. and I test these phones, but it is a good way to simulate intense gaming and just to push the chipsets to their limits. The 14 Pros get the new A16 Bionic chip, which doesn't seem to be a big upgrade and is more focused on power efficiency. Every year chipsets get better, but this time around Apple didn't even bother to compare the performance of the new one to the old one. Instead, they compared it to a 3-year-old A13 Bionic. To be honest, they don't really have to make any real performance gains because they're just so far ahead of the competition and there's a lot of room to spare. The benchmarks show that the A16 Bionic is a bigger upgrade than expected. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it does get higher scores around the board. You will, however, have to get a Pro model for the new chipset, as the regular iPhone 14 only gets the last generation's A15 Bionic. We're now approaching the 5-hour mark, and it's not looking good for the SE. The gaming round and the benchmark round took a huge hit on the battery, and it's about to die very soon. It's gonna surpass the 5-hour mark, but not by much. And we're now gonna do a standby test, as we don't use our phones constantly non-stop throughout the day. So it's interesting to see not just how well they do in standby, but also to test the new always on display, how much it affects the battery life. It's the first time around that Apple has implemented an always on display, and with an OLED panel and the new LTPO tech, which again goes down to 1 Hz, it shouldn't take a huge hit on the battery, but I guess we'll see. They were in standby for around 9 hours, and the results are not what I expected. The iPhone 12 and the iPhone 14 both lost 5%, better than the 7% lost on the iPhone 13, and a crazy 9% lost on the 13 Pro. Don't know what happened there. Maybe both the 13 and the 13 Pro are still doing some things in the background because of the iOS 16 upgrade. And also interesting, it turns out the always on display drains the battery more than expected. The 14 Pro lost a whopping 8% overnight, and while the 14 Pro Max only lost half of that, 4%, that's still double what the 13 Pro Max lost at only 2%. The always on display did eventually turn off automatically. It wasn't on for the whole 9 hours, but it still was enough to add some extra battery drain. Now before we get to the results, let me quickly tell you about this video's sponsor, ESR. They make high quality accessories for your iPhone and other Apple products. Not only do they have MagSafe compatible cases, they also have screen protectors and some great MagSafe chargers with a technology they call Cryo Boost. Silly marketing name aside, it uses cooling tech to keep your phone cool while still charging at maximum speed. This is one of their car chargers, but my favorite one is the 3-in-1 wireless charger, which allows you to wirelessly charge your iPhone, AirPods, and Apple Watch all at the same time. You can just attach your phone via MagSafe, and the magnets are actually so strong that you can use your phone comfortably while charging both in landscape and in vertical. I also think it looks pretty nice, and it's surprisingly sturdy, and what I really love is that it has a dark mode, so when you're charging at night, it doesn't disturb you. So go check out one of Amazon's top seller, ESR, by clicking the link below. But now let's finally get to the results. In last place, the iPhone SE at just over 5 hours. Not a good result at all. I wouldn't really recommend this phone. For the price of $429 and up to $550 in other countries, there's much better options available, probably a Google Pixel or a Nothing Phone 1, for example. They will get you a better phone and better battery life. And only get the iPhone SE if you just don't use your phone that much, really want an iPhone, and just really like the home button. In 7th place at 6 hours and 8 minutes, the iPhone 12. Not too bad of a result, but at $599 and even more in other countries, I wouldn't really recommend it. It's just not worth it in my opinion, unless maybe you get it refurbished. Next up, and this came as a shock to me, the iPhone 13 Pro. I don't really know why it did so poorly. It only lasted 6 hours and 21 minutes. Not sure what happened. Again, maybe it was still doing some things with the iOS 16 update in the background, and that's why it took a hit on the battery life. It's not a horrible result, just quite a bit worse than I expected, and in previous tests, it fared a lot better. Funnily enough, in 5th place is not the iPhone 13, not the 14 either. It's the 14 Pro. At 7 hours and 17 minutes, it's a very good result and a substantial improvement over its predecessor. Like last year, the non-Pro model has better battery life than the Pro model. My guess is that it's due to the 120 Hz refresh rate. Nevertheless, it should be enough to get you through the whole day without any issues. Lasting just 3 minutes longer is the iPhone 13. Still an amazing value and great battery life overall. In the past, I've done a lot of battery tests with it and it's always fared really well. Just an overall solid device, and in my eyes, a much better value than the iPhone 14, which lasted just 8 minutes longer at 7 hours and 28 minutes. Also a great result, but not much of an improvement over the iPhone 13 as expected. It's just too similar to the iPhone 13. Maybe the upgraded camera might be worth it, but for the most part, just get the iPhone 13 instead, especially now that the price was increased in most parts of the world. Here in Europe, it will cost you $1,000, and that's just too much for the iPhone 14. In second place, and with quite a big gap, the iPhone 13 Pro Max. It lasted 8 hours and 58 minutes, still outstanding battery life, and I doubt most of you will be able to kill it in a day. I feel like it has decreased a little bit, but it's still so good that you shouldn't have any issues with it. In first place, however, at 9 hours and 52 minutes, the new battery champ, the iPhone 14 Pro Max. An amazing result, and I didn't really expect it to beat the 13 Pro Max, at least not by this much. But we still have to wait and see if it can be dethroned by the 14 Plus or its Android competition. Make sure you're subscribed to not miss those battery tests when they drop. Watch this video next to see how the battery life of the iPhone 13 mini is, and I'll see you guys in the next one.